Dune Part 2 is finally here, and to no one's surprise, it's phenomenal. I think it's safe to say that after Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, Dune, and Dune Part 2, Denis Villeneuve is a sci-fi master. I feel like anytime a big blockbuster comes out, there seems to be this declaration of, you must see this on the big screen. And while I love that sentiment because I'm one of the very few who still loves movie theaters, but not all blockbusters deserve to be seen on the big screen. Dune Part 2 is absolutely a movie you need to see on the big screen. I highly recommend you see this on the big screen, and I'd even go further and suggest seeking out the biggest theater in your area because this movie is meant to be enjoyed on the biggest screen possible because it is absolutely fucking jaw-dropping. I'm happy to report here that I think Dune Part 2 is an improvement over Part 1. I really liked Part 1, but I feel like that movie suffered from its third act. I thought the first half of Dune was fantastic, but everything that happens after the siege becomes kind of uninteresting. The last hour or so just kind of meanders and didn't really build up to anything, and then the movie just ended. Luckily, Dune Part 2 doesn't have that problem. The pacing here is much improved. This movie grabbed me from frame one and never let me go throughout its nearly 3 hour runtime. And unlike Dune Part 1, Part 2 builds to an epic climax. I'm sure some could argue that this climax doesn't go too hard or doesn't have that much action, but I'd argue it's just the right amount. How many action films have we seen where the third act climax goes on for too long and just becomes a loud, obnoxious, explosion filled endurance test? Part 2 doesn't bombard us with nonstop action, and in my opinion, has just the right amount of action. And going back to the pacing, the movie is nearly 3 hours long, but they somehow managed to keep it engaging throughout. There's always something interesting going on, always a new conflict, or some sort of revelation that keeps the audience engaged. There are some things that don't quite work. This movie isn't perfect, but we'll get into that in a bit. But overall, I thought from a pacing standpoint, part two is an improvement from part one. So, as I said in my opening, this really is a movie that you should see in the biggest screen possible. And the reason for that is its grand visuals. I don't think I've ever seen a blockbuster quite like this in terms of its framing and sense of scale. Sure, part one is still visually stunning, but part two takes it to a whole other level. There is one scene in particular where Paul is learning to ride a sandworm for the first time, and it is hands down one of the most thrilling moments I've seen in quite some time. And it's because of that sense of scale and framing. And that's just one example. There are many examples, many times throughout this movie where my jaw was in my lap. I know that Christopher Nolan is known for his epic visuals, and rightly so, but there's a difference between someone like Nolan and Villeneuve. Nolan has incredible visuals, no argument here. But the difference is that Nolan likes to cut and cut often. Villeneuve, on the other hand, takes a different approach. He doesn't cut. He allows the audience to soak in the imagery, and it's extremely effective. By not cutting, he allows us to be enraptured by the world he is creating. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there's like multiple one take sequences because there's not. I'm just saying that when it comes to presenting grand visuals, Villeneuve holds onto his shots a little longer than most directors would. And aside from the great sense of scale and framing, there's also creative use of color. At one point in the movie, we go to a world that is essentially black and white. And again, it is incredible. And he uses this color change to great effect. At one moment in this world, we're watching a gladiator event and fireworks are going off overhead. But instead of actual fireworks, it looks like blots of ink exploding in the air, and then it lingers in the air, almost creating like a Rorschach test look. It is so damn cool. The one thing that worried me about this film is its large cast of characters. I'd say that unfortunately, not everyone is as fleshed out as they could be, but overall, the film handles all of its characters pretty well. And the cast here is insane, and everyone is bringing their A game. There wasn't a single performance or a single line of dialogue that I didn't believe. There are even some additional actors attached to this film that I didn't even know about, and it was a nice surprise when they turned up. I am a little disappointed that Rebecca Ferguson didn't get more screen time because I kind of love her, but I totally understand why she wasn't. Then there's Austin Butler. Austin Butler was badass and was no doubt one of the standouts. Unfortunately, he only comes in at about the halfway mark, but he definitely leaves an impression. Now, some people are claiming it's one of the best villains ever, or like the best villain since the Joker, but I'd have to disagree with both of those claims. And don't get me wrong, do not get me wrong, he is phenomenal in this movie. But one of the best villains ever? I don't know about that. Maybe when I see this again, I'll come around to that statement, but as of now, I think it's a great antagonist role, just not one of the best of all time. My only real negative about the movie is that some things felt rushed and not every character gets adequate screen time. Florence Pugh and Christopher Walken are clear examples of characters that don't get screen time. If I were to guess, I think the total screen time for Florence was maybe 10 minutes, if that. And some sequences do feel rushed, or it's like missing a scene or two. As an example, the love story between Paul and Chani felt rushed. I think the film needed just a few more scenes building up their relationship, and to my shock, they hook up way earlier than I thought they would. But hey, that's just me. Maybe it felt right to you. There's also moments where it feels like scenes were deleted and it kind of felt jarring. There's a moment where Austin Butler's character is arriving at a Fremen base and his cohorts tell him there's a lone survivor and that survivor is covered in blood. And they just quickly explain that she fought and killed some of their soldiers. This specific scene just felt a little jarring because it felt like there was a scene that showed this survivor holding down the fort, but instead we just cut to the aftermath of the fight. These are just some minor complaints, and overall, these gripes don't really derail how awesome this movie is. So overall, I think Dune Part 2 is an improvement from Part 1. It has insane visuals, great performances, and a much better pace. I was sucked into this world for nearly 3 hours, and I cannot wait to rewatch this in IMAX. The movie does end in another cliffhanger, and I, for one, will be foaming out the mouth for the next chapter in the Dune saga. I highly recommend you check out Dune Part 2.